In the 1920s and 30s, influenced by the positional warfare of World War I, the major military powers of Europe constructed systems of fixed fortifications. It was thought that fortifications would be able to protect a country's borders or specific crucial regions from invasion. These fixed defenses were integral to the strategic planning of France, Germany, and the Soviet Union. Each country developed fortified areas in their own way, combining bunkers, infantry and vehicle obstacles, medical units, communication systems, and many other elements. Engineers and planners did their best to anticipate any potential enemy attack. We have decided to rate each defensive line in terms of length, degree of complexity at the time of construction, and how well each one held up when put to the ultimate test, enemy invasion. First off, let's see which defensive line was the longest. According to the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was banned from having any kind of defensive structures on its borders. Nevertheless, when the Nazis took power in 1933, they began constructing lines of fortifications. In 1934, the first gun emplacements appeared on the border of the country that posed the greatest threat to Germany at the time, France. These fortifications formed the basis of Germany's West Wall, also known as the Siegfried Line. The Siegfried Line was built to protect the borders from a French attack. However, the very first gun emplacements could withstand only bullets and light artillery fire. In 1936, the construction of larger and more heavily armed defenses began. The Siegfried Line stretched along the borders with France, Luxembourg, and Belgium, and part of the border with the Netherlands. The total length of the line was about 630 kilometers, putting the Siegfried Line in third place in our rating of the longest defensive lines. Now let's see which line takes second place. France was deeply scarred by the horrors of World War I and looked at Germany as a possible future threat. The construction of a French defensive line began in 1929. The person most responsible for the construction of the defenses was André Maginot, the French Minister of War. The total length of the line along the border with Germany was more than 360 kilometers until 1936, much shorter than the Siegfried Line. However, the line continued north along the borders with Luxembourg and Belgium to the Atlantic Ocean. In addition, the Maginot Line also stretched south along the borders with Switzerland and Italy. The total length of the European portion of the line was about 750 kilometers.
The cost of the Maginot Line was, in current values from today, about 3 billion euros. It was not so expensive, and that includes the fortification along the German border, the Italian border. You have also casemates on the island Corsica, and casemates in Tunisia. It's called the Maret Line. It's part of the Maginot Line.
So Germany's Siegfried was 630 kilometers long, and the French Maginot Line was 750 kilometers. But is that really long? Let's find out by comparing them to the Stalin Line. After the Russian Civil War ended, the Soviet Union saw itself as besieged by the hostile capitalistic countries of the world, presumably led by Great Britain and France. It began to fortify its borders. The construction of a chain of fortifications began in 1928. These fortifications were to stretch from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea and had to protect the most important industrial cities and regional centers of the USSR. At first, there were 13 fortified areas, and 8 more were added over the next 10 years. By the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, there were 22 fortified areas in the defensive line. Their total length was 1,800 kilometers, more than 1.5 times the length of the Siegfried and the Maginot Lines combined. So the Stalin Line convincingly occupies first place as the longest defensive line. Which line was the most advanced and complex from an engineering point of view? Let's find out. "90% of the emplacements of the Stalin Line were equipped with machine guns. When construction began, it was thought that these emplacements would be used to defend against attacks by infantry and horse cavalry. By the mid-1930s, the most widely used gun emplacements were machine gun and cannon bunkers. They typically had 2 to 4 Maxim machine guns, crewed by 10 to 12 troops. Some 2-story bunkers were built. The weapons were emplaced on the upper story, while the lower story held supplies and living space for the personnel. Some bunkers had 76mm guns. The opening through which the cannon fired, known as the embrasure, was often protected by an armored shield that would be raised and lowered by a hoist. In large bunkers, there were warehouses for weapons, ammunition, and provisions. Such a fortification might have a crew of 30 troops. Telephone communication systems were set up to coordinate action between gun emplacements. For vision, all-round view periscopes were used. Large fortifications were equipped with air filters to allow personnel to survive a gas attack. In the most important sectors, multiple pillboxes were built so they could support each other with fire. Sometimes they were connected with each other by tunnels. However, the Soviet Union did not manage to fully complete the planned emplacements of the Stalin Line. Inspections in early 1939 found some serious design flaws. Some bunkers were ineffectively positioned. They did not have sufficient fields of vision and could not deliver long-range fire. Some fortifications appeared to be flooded. There was not enough electrical equipment to supply power to all fortifications. Some pillboxes had no camouflage, and some did not even have the required top layer of soil. The quality of concrete was also inconsistent. So, despite the planned immensity, the Stalin Line loses out to the German and French lines in terms of infrastructure and equipment. That's why we rank the Stalin Line third in fortification complexity. What comes in second? Let's find out. Compared to the Soviet fortifications, the Siegfried Line was significantly more imposing. You'll understand why it captures second place in our ranking. The Siegfried Line was designed to be a much more rugged system of barriers, obstacles, and fortifications. When passing through it, an advancing army was to be constantly impeded and worn down until it finally became exhausted. The first barrier line was relatively weak. It consisted mostly of tree obstacles, wooden anti-tank teeth on narrow roads, and other barriers covered by advanced posts and machine gun detachments. Generally, the first line of defense was not designed to inflict heavy losses on the enemy, but to force the enemy to put its forces into assault formation, attack, and by doing so, lose time. There would be individual earth timber bunkers between the first and second lines at key points, such as crossroads, bridges, and small villages. These would engage enemy forces, inflicting losses and causing more delays. The second line of defense consisted of anti-tank barriers and concrete emplacements, pillboxes, and bunkers. This line was quite robust, but still passable. The enemy forces might break through, but then they would again face individual fortifications at key points. Behind these would be the third and strongest line of defense. This system of defenses would sap the attacking enemies of his momentum, bogging them down and inflicting mounting casualties. At the critical moment, German forces would counterattack and defeat their adversary. The Siegfried Line fortifications that were built first were mostly earth and timber, and sometimes concrete. The walls were 30 to 60 centimeters thick. There were also more robust bunkers with the frontal wall about 1 meter thick. Among other obstacles, there were multiple rows of barbed wire entanglements and wooden, metal, or concrete anti-tank obstacles. After 1936 and up to the beginning of the war, the Germans devoted significant resources to the construction of fortifications. The walls of some structures built during this period were 2 to 3.5 meters thick. The thickest walls were designed to withstand a hit by a 520mm anti-concrete shell or a 1,000-kilogram aircraft bomb. 23,000 trucks were used in the construction of the Siegfried Line. About 4,500 rail cars were unloaded every day. 3,500 buses took people to the construction site. In addition to bunkers, key avenues of approach were guarded by the concrete anti-tank teeth known as dragon's teeth. They stretched for dozens of kilometers in multiple rows. So you might think that no one could surpass the German engineers in constructing complex and intricate fortified areas, but that's exactly what the French did. The Maginot Line was made up of three types of defensive complexes: fortified areas, fortified sectors, and fortified ground. There was an outpost line in front of the main fortifications, anti-tank ditches, barbed wire entanglements, and small pillboxes. Fortified areas were the most heavily protected. These were the most likely sectors of enemy advance. Fortified areas were defended by systems of large and small forts and individual long-range gun emplacements. All were camouflaged and were designed to survive artillery fire, including direct hits by large-caliber shells. The thickness of concrete flooring in the pillboxes and forts was up to 3 meters. According to the estimates of French military engineers, a fire emplacement was expected to continue operating even after being hit by two 420mm howitzer shells. Fortified sectors were built at the secondary areas of defense. They were not as well protected, but were still guarded by numbers of small intermediary fortifications and several forts that could provide each with covering fire. The areas that were considered least suitable for enemy advance were protected by so-called fortified ground. These consisted of a small number of pillboxes in key positions or near important objectives. It may be said that they were built just in case. Forts and big intermediate fortifications were often multi-story. Like icebergs, the greater part of the fortifications was hidden underground, with only gun and machine gun casements on the surface. Some rooms were 50 meters underground. Below the thick concrete, there were living quarters, hospitals, headquarters, electrical stations, and storage rooms for food, water, and ammunition. Forts were equipped with elevators, lifts, and even narrow-gauge railways to transport soldiers and ammunition. The French were the only nation to use armored domes in their fortifications. These domes would be open to let the guns fire, and then closed to protect the embrasures from enemy fire. The Maginot Line is a true masterpiece of engineering, so it deservedly occupies first place in our rating of the most elaborate and technologically advanced war fortifications.
And something who was paradoxal, the Maginot Line was provided with 700 anti-tank guns, and they destroyed only 1 German tanks because the German tanks passed through Belgium. But at that time, the French army, and something is not known, we had 5,000 anti-tank guns, 25 millimeters, 37, 75 and 47 anti-tank guns on wheels, and we had a lot of anti-tank guns, but much more anti-tank guns than the German tanks. But the operative way of the German was very fine, and they pierce where we don't, they pierce very strongly in Belgium or in the Ardennes, and it works like we want it.
So, we've judged which defensive line was the longest and which line was the most advanced. Now it's time to see how effective these lines proved to be. Which line presented the most effective barrier to an attacking enemy? We'll find out in a few moments. Battle effectiveness, 3rd place. The most sophisticated defensive line in Europe, the Maginot Line, was barely a factor in the combat of World War II. Of course, the Germans struck where the French did not expect, the Ardennes. This region of mountains and thick forest had been considered impassable for large troop formations, and especially for tank divisions, the main striking force of the Wehrmacht. How wrong everyone was. This was the weakest point in the Maginot Line. After passing through the Ardennes, German forces engaged the small Le Fert fortification. Its garrison held out for only 2 days. During the invasion of France, the Germans engaged separate, sometimes unfinished fortifications of the Maginot Line on several other occasions. The main part of the Maginot Line waved the white flag after the capitulation of France.
French begin fortification along the border with Germany and Italy to avoid a blitz attack from Italy or Germany, and to permit the mobilization of the French army that takes 20 days. And another mission of the Maginot Line was to oblige the enemies to pass through a neutral country, Belgium or Switzerland. And if the German came through Belgium into France, you will have the British who enter into war at your side, and you have an international conflict. And that was the political reason of the construction of the French fortification.
So the most fortified and developed defensive line, the Maginot Line, comes in 3rd in battle effectiveness. Let's see which line managed to hold back the enemy for a bit longer. The massive German invasion of the 22nd of June 1941 quickly pushed the Red Army back from the border. The fighting reached the Stalin Line quite soon after that. Most of its fortified areas didn't last long against German forces. The Ostropol and Letychev fortified areas held out for 10 days. The Kingisepp fortified region fought for 2 weeks. One pillbox in the Mogilov-Podolsk fortified area held out for a week until all soldiers in its garrison were dead. The most robust Kiev fortified area resisted the enemy for a month. It surrendered only after the forces of the Southern Front were surrounded and crushed near Kiev. The most outstanding success was the 22nd Karelia fortified area, which stretched from Sestroretsk to Lake Ladoga.
This was the only fortified area of the Stalin Line that fulfilled its mission completely. It prevented the enemy from reaching Leningrad, the second largest city and the main industrial center of the USSR. So, the fortifications in the Karelia sector performed exceptionally well.
This sector, which included 196 defensive emplacements, fought from September 1941 to June 1944. The Stalin Line fortifications weren't designed to fight a battle in isolation. It was assumed that the fixed emplacements would be supported by a combined arms fighting force. But such tactics were hard to implement at the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviet portion of World War II is known in the former Soviet countries. Overall, we award the Soviet defensive line second place in our ranking of battle effectiveness. Although the Siegfried Line wasn't the longest or most technologically advanced, it proved to be the hardest defensive line to defeat. During World War II, the Siegfried Line played its role twice. The first time was in the so-called Phony War, when French attacks failed to penetrate even the first line of German fortifications. After France surrendered in 1940, the Siegfried Line became useless for Germany. All building plans were canceled. Workers were moved to other projects. Many of the garrison troops were used as infantry on other fronts. Unfinished emplacements were dismantled and other bunkers were deactivated. In 1944, after the Allies landed in Normandy, the Germans made an attempt to reactivate the Siegfried Line. However, the structures of the late 1930s were obsolete and couldn't provide protection against the weapons of the Allies' forces. Germany lacked the time and the resources to build new defensive structures. Some new bunkers and concrete pillboxes were built, incorporating the turrets of the Panther tank. Also, a network of Tobruk bunkers were hastily built. These were concrete firing positions for a single soldier with a machine gun or a grenade launcher. Allied forces advanced to the German border in September 1944. It seemed likely that they would be able to pass through this skeleton of defensive line with ease. However, the Germans fought tenaciously through the winter of 1944 to 1945. The last chapter in the battle history of the Siegfried Line did not end until March 1945, when the German border was penetrated in several locations. Although the Siegfried Line didn't entirely play the role it was designed to, it managed to hold back the enemy longer than the Maginot Line or the Stalin Line. That's why we award the Siegfried Line first place in terms of battle effectiveness. Let's summarize. Each fortified area had its own specific features. The Siegfried Line was well organized and held back enemy forces twice, during the Phony War of 1939 to 1940 and after the landing of the Western Allies in Europe in 1944 to 1945. The Maginot Line was much better than its competitors in technological equipment and defensive systems. However, it was outflanked and barely saw combat. The Stalin Line was the simplest from an engineering point of view, but except for the Karelia sector, wasn't able to hold the enemy back for very long. This line was the longest defensive line of World War II. We may wonder, what if the building of these defensive lines had been completed? Would the course of the war have been different? Questions like these will remain just questions. History has delivered its verdict.